So the DSM artificially divides a few general underlying vulnerabilities into dozens of specific diagnoses. And you can't advertise a drug, a pharmaceutical drug, according to the FDA, according to its 1962 ruling, unless you're applying it to a specific diagnosis. So that's why the DSM has all these different diagnoses to allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise for this specific diagnosis. But for example, drugs for depression, SRIs for depression, they work even better for anxiety, but you can't advertise them for anxiety. You can only advertise them for depression. So we have no genetic evidence for the inheritance of specific mental health disorders over and above the inheritance of general liabilities to broad tendencies towards neuroticism, psychosis, externalization. So we have these broad susceptibilities to a whole host of mental disorders. And then certain cultural and personal contexts will have a huge role whether or not these predispositions become evident or stay latent. So the DSM has tried to map a landscape of mental disorders by drawing lines around clusters of specific symptoms as if they were islands, but mental disorders are more like ecosystems. They are areas of Arctic tundra, boreal, forest, and swamp blending into one another, defying crisp boundaries, notes one psychiatrist. So the initial pharmaceutical drugs we developed in the 1950s, chlorpromazine for schizophrenia, lithium for bipolar, imipramine, and the MAOIs for depression, they still form the biological template for the most commonly prescribed pharmaceutical drugs today, such as Abilify, Cymbalta, Zyprexa, Risperdal, and Seroquel. And despite all the hyperbole that surrounds the promotion of these new medications, we have no evidence that they work any better than these 1950s medications. My life was changed by taking an MAOI inhibitor, the MAO inhibitor, Nardil. In 1993, I was bedridden. I got on Nardil. I started getting better immediately. So Nardil essentially been around since the 1950s, and it worked great for me. It got me out of a bedridden state to 2/3 of a normal life. So all these new pharmaceuticals that we have, such as Abilify, Cymbalta, Zyprexa, Risperdal, and Seroquel, there's no evidence that they're any better than the 1950s drugs, but because the patents expired on the 1950s drugs, pharmaceutical companies have to rejigger them a little bit so that they can patent and then promote them so that doctors will prescribe them. Our current drugs for the treatment of psychosis, they're no better than the drugs we had in the 1950s. So we've had 60 years after the discovery of antidepressant medications. We don't know how they work, and the medications we have now are no more effective than the ones we had 50, 60 years ago. So we've had more than 60 different types of antipsychotic drugs enter the marketplace since the 1950s. None show greater efficacy than the initial antipsychotics. Lithium has been widely employed since the 1950s. It's now less likely to be prescribed than recent, far more costly medications, but lithium is still the best. It is the unsurpassed mood-stabilizing drug for treating bipolar conditions. So current antipsychotic meds have different side effects than the initial drugs, but it's not at all clear that they have more benign consequences overall than the original 1950s drugs like lithium. The effectiveness of SSRIs and SSNIs, no evidence that they're more effective than the 1950s drugs. The improvement that occurs with antidepressant medications can be overwhelmingly accounted for by the placebo effect. So only about 1 in 10 patients given an antidepressant is likely responding to the drug in a favorable way. The other 9 favorable results, if you have 10 favorable results, the other 9 are likely the placebo effect. And even these findings are likely to be inflated because only studies with positive results for pharmaceutical drugs are going to be submitted to the FDA. So if you take into account published research as well as unpublished research, then there's virtually no difference in outcomes between those who receive an antidepressant and those who receive a placebo. So the DSM categories themselves are responsible for the stagnation in progress in drug development. We've had no new efficacious psycho drugs entering the market in the past 30 years. And pharmaceutical companies are not enamored with the revival of psychedelic drugs. because these psychedelics are used a handful of times. They're not taken in daily doses. So let's find that. All right, so one trend is we've got a revival of psychedelic substances as treatments for mental disorders. So we've got all these drugs associated with the 1960s counterculture and the recreational club scene. They're now heralded as groundbreaking responses to various mental illnesses, such as ketamine. So ketamine used to be known as a date rape drug. Now it's being hailed as the most important advance in depression research in the last half century. Another psychiatrist says CBD is the most promising drug that has come out for neuropsychiatric disease in the last 50 years. MDMA, ecstasy, is now a prominent new treatment for PTSD, as is psilocybin, the active ingredient in hallucinogenic mushrooms for depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. Ayahuasca, many mental health professionals see it as an effective treatment for anxiety and addiction. And then you got LSD. It's now undergoing a revival as a treatment for anorexia, addiction, and depression. So pharmaceutical companies cannot be happy with the revival of non-proprietary drugs that are used a handful of times rather than taken in daily doses across lifetimes. So there's a huge pharmaceutical boom, and its headquarters is in Los Angeles. And there's a great article about that in Los Angeles Magazine that was highlighted on the drug report. This is LA on acid. Shrooms, shamans, kosher LSD, while Los Angeles is tripping out. Housewives in the Hollywood Hills are doing it, hipsters in Los Feliz too. LA has become ground zero for a new hallucinogenic boom, with ayahuasca ceremonies now as common as barbecues. Is microdosing shrooms really the answer to what ails us?